exceeded our wildest expectations. We didn't invite you for nothing. Thank you very much. Very much to the debate. Now we turn to Congressman Wolf. It's a tremendous honor to have you here. You are already a representative here in the United States of Virginia for your 17th term. It is enormous. You've made religious freedom as one of your spare hats in your professional being as a member of Congress. And you are known also outside the United States, and we are very happy and honored to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Wolf.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to the Library of Congress. We want to welcome all of you, particularly from who are outside of the United States. We welcome you here into this Library of Congress, and this is the members' room. So thank you very much for being here and for the invitation. Jesus, in reading from Isaiah at the synagogue in Nazareth, said, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." I intend my remarks today to focus on the plight of the persecuted church globally and religious freedom, and the obligation of the church in the West to advocate for our received brothers and sisters around the world. I'm keenly aware that the problems facing our country and the West today are not purely political or even mostly political, and as such, the solutions will not, even though I serve in Congress, will not ultimately come from government. That is not to say that political leadership is unimportant, but I believe even as one serving in government, that we do our nation a disservice if we assume that we can solve all of our problems politically. For I would argue there's something far greater that is ailing our country, and respectfully, if I can say, ailing the West. Something that is profoundly moral in nature. Something that necessitates, I believe, a spiritual antidote. Something that demands, in the words of that great Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, speaking of the American church, he beheld in the 19th century when he said, "Pulpits aflame with righteousness." Today in America, we are witnesses to insidious relativism that teaches that concepts of right and wrong are old-fashioned, antiquated, and even judgmental. Vices are elevated, virtues are mocked, and faith is squeezed out of the public square. Our culture is coarsened as a result. These seemingly intangible realities have profound implications. We do ourselves and Jesus a disservice if we seek to water down His life and the message in the hopes of drawing others in. An anemic version of Christianity that is only modestly different than the culture of our day is not the answer. To understand how the church must respond, we must first understand what is taking place in the broader culture. There is much that could be said on this score, but given the time limitations, and I've cut this down a number of times, I will focus on one component. Namely, the elevation of tolerance as the premier virtue. Without question, there are merits to tolerance, but when tolerance is demanded at all costs, when Orthodox Christianity is deemed intolerant, when government and even society fails to extend tolerance to people of faith, we are headed down a perilous path. Strikingly, this is the very road we find ourselves traveling. In many respects, the church itself has struggled to find its voice. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, rather than positing a radical alternative to the culture, we are in too many ways simply culture-light. I'm a great admirer of Princeton University McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, Robbie George. Himself a Catholic, Robbie is fully engaged in this ongoing national conversation He's the co-chairman of the Religious Freedom Commission, which we set up in Congress about 12 years ago, and is a prolific thinker and writer. In a First Things post this past summer, he offered up, by his own description, an unlicensed sermon. It is, I believe, a fitting clarion call to the church, and I think, respectfully, to all of the West. Robbie writes as follows, quote, "For those of us who are Christian, and I suspect the same is true of our friends of other religious traditions, it is tempting to embrace these doctrines and teachings of our faith that are acceptable to the beautiful people, to the trendsetters, to the opinion shapers, to the powerful, to the influential, while going silent or even denying those teachings that will mark us as standing in opposition to the values that are dominant in elite sectors of our culture." He went on to say, "We are all too willing to be tame, T-A-M-E, tame Christians. We want the comforts, the consolation of religion, but we like to have them without risk or cost." He said, "We simply don't want to jeopardize friendships, family relationships, professional and economic opportunities, prestige, social status, and the like. We don't want people to think of us as retrograde or out of touch with the times, and much less as intolerant or prejudiced. So we attempted," he said, "to pick and choose to be, as he calls it, cafeteria Christians. But," he said, "if we are serious about our faith, we will understand that a true Christian is never a tame Christian. A true Christian will stand up and speak out for what is good and what is true, what is right and what is just, both in season and out of season. He or she will not go silent, even when bearing witness is unpopular, even when it is personally or professionally risky. He or she will know that there is truly a cost, that there is a cost to discipleship, and will be prepared, with God's help and by His grace, to pay that cost, whatever it turns out to be. Increasingly, I am of the mind that Christians, lay leaders and pastors alike, are going to face situations that are not simply culturally unpopular, that force us to choose between God and Caesar, between our conscience and the law. Cardinal Francis George, former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the current Archbishop of Chicago in 2010, predicted the following. He said, "I expect to die in my bed, my successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square." Is this alarmist? I pray so, but the evidence before us at least demands an examination of that prospect. At other critical junctures in human history, Christian leaders of great consequences often reserve their most severe criticism for the fellow believers, not out of a spirit of harshness, but rather love, a desire for the church to fulfill its calling. The Reverend Martin Luther King, who was revered here in the United States, wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail, and it is addressed, at that time he was in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, for standing up for what he believed was right. And it was addressed to the fellow clergymen of the United States. In the letter, he explains with great eloquence and relevance for today the difference between a just law and an unjust law, writing as follows, quote, he said, "We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. And everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I'm sure," he said, "had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers." He went on to say, "If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith were suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws." King continues, admonishing the church, "I must honestly reiterate," he said, "that I've been disappointed. I have been disappointed with the church. When I was suddenly catapulted," he said, "into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt, he said, I would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, the priests, and the rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, he said, some have been outright opponents. All too many have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. What an indictment from a man of the cloth writing to fellow clergymen as he languishes behind the bars in jail in Birmingham, Alabama. Are we in 2014 more cautious or more courageous? Are we in 2014 willing to risk imprisonment in the face of an unjust law? These are profound questions of conscience which every man and woman must answer for themselves and may be coming sooner than many realize. King concludes, he says, in deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There was a time, he said, when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of public opinion. It was a thermostat. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils, he said, of infanticide. To gliding it with him, with my meeting in tow. On this particular day, we happened upon some visiting Chinese tourists at the foot of the Capitol stairs. The couple was visiting their son in the United States, who was himself a seminary student. He was a seminary student, I believe, at Trinity in Chicago. While we shared no common language, it was immediately apparent that they recognized Pastor Bowley. They regularly watched this pastor teaching online, and they were overjoyed to meet him literally at the steps of the Capitol. I later asked this Chinese-American pastor, Pastor Bowley, if he felt it was more difficult to be a Christian in the U.S. or a Christian in China. He answered unequivocally and counterintuitively that it was more difficult to be a Christian in America. Perhaps not difficult in the ways we would think. There are certainly tangible threats to religious freedom in the U.S. No one is being arrested for going to an unregistered church. No one is being beaten for ministry in Holy Communion. Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey was given Holy Communion by Bishop Sue, and he's never been seen again. That does not happen here in the United States. But this pastor's answer certainly was thought-provoking. It caused me to question whether the lure toward tame Christianity of the sort that Robbie George described was in some way more insidious and threatening than the actual promise of physical persecution. In fact, persecution is as old as the church. Most historians believe that the disciple Stephen was stoned to death just 1 year after Jesus' death on the cross. Of course, these horrific tales of persecution are not simply relegated to the ancient history books. Author Alan Hertzke, I'm sure many of you have read his book, notes that the suffering church today constitutes nearly 1/3 of the total Christian population. And looking to the Middle East today, we see violence and repression against religious communities, which specifically target religious minorities, including Christians. This must be viewed not simply as today's news, but rather through the lens of history. Faith not often heard outside the majority Muslim world is first the Sephardi people and then the Sunni people. The Sephardi people are, of course, the Jewish people. Except for Israel, their once vibrant communities and countries throughout the region are now decimated. In 1948, the Jewish population of Iraq was roughly 150,000. Today, no more than officially 4 individuals remain, and I'm told it's now down to perhaps 1 elderly gentleman. In Egypt, the Jewish population was once as many as 80,000. We went there last year. I met with the leader of the Jewish community and said, because the cemetery has been overrun, if you've been to Cairo, and some of the synagogues have been overrun, and I said, what is the Jewish population? She says, roughly 20 more or less, and it is less. And she said, we are all women, and we are all well over the age of 60. Over the span of a few decades, the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, has virtually been empty of the Jewish community. In my conversations with the Syrian Christian refugees, we went down to the border in the Bekaa Valley and met with some as they came out to listen to them. And Lebanese Christians and Coptic Christians in Egypt, a resounding theme emerged, a similar fate may await the Sunday people. Coptic Christians numbering roughly 8 to 10 million are leaving in droves in face of increased repression, persecution, and violence. The Coptic Christian community is afraid in Egypt. A little more comfort maybe with General Sisi, but they are afraid. I remember once my government, I went there, I had a bill dealing with this issue, and my government brought in Coptic Christian leaders, and they all told me that my bill was a bad idea, the bill to create a Religious Freedom Commission. They went around one by one, and then when the meeting was over, 4 or 5 came up and told me to keep pushing the bill. And one said, the waters are now moving. The Coptic Christians live in fear in Egypt. Similarly, Iraq's Christian population has fallen from as many as 1.3 million in 2003 to roughly, some say 300,000, others say 230,000. And Christian churches are being targeted, believers kidnapped for ransom, and families threatened with violence if they stay. While it remains to be seen whether the historic exodus of Christians from the region will prove to be as dramatic as what has happened to the Jewish community, it is without questioning devastating as it threatens to erase Christianity from their very, very roots. I had people come in 2 weeks ago, an expert on what was going on, and he said there were reports of Christian women being tied with ropes, and one jeep goes that way and one jeep goes that way. And you've seen the reports of some of the beheadings and some of the things like that. We also see anti-Semitism growing in the world, in Europe, but also on the campuses here in the United States. Consider Iraq. With the exception of Israel, the Bible contains more references to the cities, the regions, and nations of ancient Iraq than any other country. The patriarch Abraham is from the city in Iraq called Ur. On my first trip to Iraq when the war broke out, the Bush administration wouldn't let us go, so we went in with a private group, and I went up to these Constantine wires, and I told the guy that I did for a living. He brought me in, and finally he said, do you know what's here? It was in Nasiriyah. It's the place where Jessica Lynch, the young girl, was taken to the hospital. He said, this is the site, this is Ur. And they took me to the site. There was an elderly man sitting there on a little bench, and they said, this is the site of Abraham's village. And I climbed a ziggurat. If you look at some old Bibles, they have the picture of the ziggurat, 2200 BC. I even felt guilty kind of climbing it because I didn't want to do any damage to it. But Abraham is from Iraq. Isaac's bride, Rebecca, came from northwest Iraq. Jacob spent 20 years in Iraq, and his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, were born in northwest Iraq. Ezekiel is buried in Iraq. A remarkable spiritual revival is told in the book of Jonah occurred in Nineveh, and you may have seen the pictures a month ago when I spoke on the floor of the house of the tomb. They believe may or may not be, but Jonah's tomb has been blown up. And the events of the book of Esther took place in Iraq, as did the accounts of Daniel, who was buried in Iraq. In Egypt, some 2,000 years ago, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus sought refuge in his land from the murderous aim of King Herod. Egypt's Coptic community traces its origins to the Apostle Mark. In the Middle East, if it is effectively empty of Christian faith, those of the Christian faith, It will have grave geopolitical and I would argue spiritual implications. We had some nuns come by from Mosul, Nineveh. They speak Aramaic. They speak the same language as Jesus. To empty many of the Christians in 2005 and 6 left Iraq and went to Damascus. And now things are so bad they've actually left Damascus and have come back and now have been forced out and are now up in the north. Couple this with a virtual silence on the part of the West, and there have been some exceptions. These vulnerable faith communities that are now part of the fabric of the historic Middle East are left feeling abandoned. They say, Mr. Wolf, why isn't anyone in the West speaking out? You know, Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, who was the president when I ran for office. I lost in 76 and lost in 78 and won, not because of me, but because of Reagan. President Reagan says the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. Reagan said it was not just for the people in Philadelphia in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence or 1787 on the signing of the Constitution. Reagan said it was a covenant with the entire world, with the students in Tiananmen, with people all over. These vulnerable faith communities are part of the fabrics, and they wonder, why is the West not really speaking out? Jesus of Nazareth had much to say about the persecuted, the oppressed, and the imprisoned. But is the church in the West today burdened by the great injustice of religious persecution? Not because we're driven by guilt, but because we are motivated by faith. Not because of some tired sense of obligation, but because of a vibrant biblical mandate. I'm increasingly convinced that the discussion or lack thereof among government leaders, opinion makers on this issue of religious persecution is simply a downstream manifestation of what is happening in the broader culture, and specifically in the faith community domestically. If the church in the West has failed to prioritize the plight of the church globally, can we reasonably expect government leaders to do so? And I think, in summary, one of the concerns is that we who are people who follow Jesus, who have advocated for so many causes and done so many good things. The doctor in Africa, Dr. Brantley, was a Christian who was over there fighting Ebola when the World Health Organization was asleep and our CDC here in the United States was asleep. When you look and see what Christians are doing around the world, for some reason, we have almost bought into the opposition's arguments that the Christians were the crusaders. And they've done all these bad things, and we begin to accept the premise of those who are against Christianity, we have almost lost the battle. And I believe we all have, those of us who follow Jesus, have an obligation and have a duty to speak out and advocate, not only for Christians who are being persecuted and religious freedom, but religious freedom is not only for a Christian somewhere, but it's also for the Buddhists in Tibet. It's for the Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan. It's for the Baha'is who are in jail in Iran. It is for everybody of faith to be able to speak out and let them worship. And for the voices in the West to be relatively silent, I think it's almost created an environment. So what I would urge is that we change and do things differently. We begin to speak out, as Jesus said in these opening passages that I read. Thank you very, very much.